Welcome to today's webinar, and thank you for taking time out of your busy day to spend time with us on what is apparently a very hot topic. Many people registered for this webinar, which did surprise us a little bit, but apparently it's something people are wanting to know, and that's a great thing. So we're going to start out this first part, a three-part series of demystifying the PCR LCA EPD creation process, standards, tools, and trends. So today we're going to be focusing on the starting point in the process, which is creating product category rules. What really is quite surprising is how recently the interest in PCR LCA EPD creation has burgeoned. And not surprisingly, people don't really like to change until they have to, and carbon and climate are top of mind in most places today. And so everybody is doing what they need to do to pitch in and combat what's happening with the climate. So what we're going to let you in on is kind of an insider's view of the industry and how the industry has been evolving to address the understanding of the environmental impacts of what we do in the world. In this case, it's in the building construction industry, and how the LCA community has participated in creating awareness around how to measure and report, and how the community has responded to creating technical tools, programs, and standards as the market demand has risen. As promised, we have a packed agenda, and with me today is my colleague, Kim Hammer. Kim and I have worked together 10 years now, Kim? 8 years? Feels like we've always been together. And Kim runs our technical program as well as being a senior LCA analyst herself. So we're going to start at the beginning of the story, and for those of you who are wondering, yes, you will get a recording of the webinar, a little housekeeping. You will get a recording. You can request the deck in response to the email where you'll get the link to the recording, and feel free to ask your questions, put those questions into the questions panel. And we have one of our LCA experts, Tejan Adhikari, monitoring the questions panel, and he will real-time answer your questions, as well as any that don't get answered. We'll see about the time at the end where we can take questions together. Any of your questions that we don't get answered, please leave in the exit survey on your way out, and we will be sure to get those answered. So packed agenda, it's what we promised in the email invitation. And we're going to start out with our backstory about when and why Sustainable Minds became a program operator, and then everything through today and current state, what's happening. For those of you who are interested in starting PCR projects, you should feel no longer mystified by the end. You'll know how to get started and take action. And for those of you who know that there are PCRs for the categories that your products are in, you'll also know how to move forward with creating LCAs and EPDs. So again, backstory and a little bit of the memory lane. It was back in 2012 when LEED version 4 was introduced to include for the first time credits for reporting the environmental performance of products. And this was a pilot credit. It was entirely new. And as those of us in the LCA industry read through the credit, we were like, that is awesome. LCA is finally going to get, some public public airtime and how it can get used. But then as we thought more about it, and this is we now at Sustainable Minds, we thought, wow, how's that even going to work? There's going to be product category rules that are needed. There's hardly any that exist today. Oh my God, it's going to require companies and industries to come together and decide how to do LCA to measure. How do they even know where there are any PCRs that exist already? There's no repository. And PCR development is facilitated by program operators who certify EPDs to the PCRs they develop. How does that work? And it's really expensive. PCRs could cost between 50 to 200K, requiring 6 months to 3 years. And I want to point out, these are slides from a webinar we did in 2012. So 12 years ago, these were the questions we were asking then. That's why I made the point of putting the year the slide is from. You can see it in the footer, but also up there. And we said, you know, EPDs, there's so much content in an EPD. How do you know what to put in an EPD? And then we did a massive research study looking at EPDs from all over the world, trying to figure out, like, how is an EPD going to be useful for an architect, builder, or contractor to make a purchase decision? There's so much technical data, it's so confusing. There's no marketing info. They're not comparable. How is this ever going to work? Again, 2012. Then in 2013, as you know, LEED was picking up some traction and people were getting some more visibility into LCA, we finally were like, look, LEED version 4 is the tipping point. It is all about product transparency. EPDs, HPDs got developed and announced, and now there was kind of this wholesale adoption of the ISO standards for PCR, LCA, and EPD creation. And, you know, it was game on that this is happening. Let's make it happen. So by 2014, there wasn't really much happening, unfortunately. And so we started to publicly wonder, will building product manufacturers actually be ready for LEED version 4? Because remember, it was still the pilot program, and it was targeted to be the actual program in 2015, but not enough PCRs, EPDs, material ingredient disclosures were getting developed at a fast enough rate for that program to supersede version 3, which is why the transparency credits stayed as pilot credits for such a long time. And so, kept asking the questions, will there be enough EPDs? Well, there won't be, because there aren't enough PCRs. And if you just literally do the math, PCRs took a really long time, took a lot of money. Then LCAs took a really long time. EPDs took a really long time. I mean, so you just do the math. It was like, how is this ever going to work? And so the conclusion is, we've got to figure this out. We have got to make it easy for manufacturers to get started and help people help the building industry earn those pilot credits now. So here at Sustainable Minds, we said, like, okay, what are we going to do? We are going to figure out how to get into this business, because we were in the LCA tool business, but we said, this is a business that needs to get some innovation happening. We love innovation. Let's figure this out, because we already were, like I said, in the LCA tool business, delivering LCAs and building software. And so we did a quick survey of who was doing what in the current landscape, what services each of those deliver. And as a tool provider, we wanted to be able to collaborate with everyone in the LCA industry. So we decided that we would become a program operator, also deliver LCA services, create PCRs, but for the purpose of publishing EPDs. And the way we really got started was by inventing a new kind of EPD and pointing out that that's what the industry needs, is a new kind of useful EPD. The PCR is a means to an end. That's all it is. It's a means to an end to get more EPDs into the market that are useful to make decisions. And so we introduced what we call the transparency report. It is an EPD. It's 3 pages. It's delivered online. It's the first digital EPD. People are talking about digital EPDs, but it was the first digital EPD. ISO 14025 says program operators can call their type 3 environmental declarations anything they want. EPD is also a made-up term. So we call ours a transparency report to indicate that it's more than just an EPD with data. And we introduced the first 2-part PCR program available in North America. And so today, in 2024, we are the only end-to-end product transparency solutions provider who is a program operator doing PCR, EPD creation and publishing, delivering LCA and material ingredient disclosure services, training and education, and building innovative digital reporting tools like our transparency report and the transparency catalog, because transparency tools are marketing tools that help people make decisions about products to get them into projects. So this is what we deliver. This is the EPD creation process. At high level, it starts with ISO standards. Those standards drive the PCR development process, which drives the LCA creation process, which then that data goes into the environmental product declaration. So you want to think of an EPD as almost an executive summary of the LCA, leaving out confidential information. And so from here, I'm going to throw it over to Kim to walk us through what's happening present day. Kim.
Sure. So we'll talk about kind of why more PCRs are needed and why they should all be created the same way. And I'll repeat what Terry said here and say that the demand for PCRs is being driven by the market's demand for this environmental performance in the form of EPDs. So in order to get those EPDs, manufacturers need to do LCAs according to PCRs. And right now there are only a limited number of product categories that are covered. But meanwhile, there are calls from government through funding from the IRA to support the development of EPDs, and through state buy-clean legislation. There's calls from EPDs from industry through USGBC LEED requirements, AIA. And in addition to those architects, engineers, contractors, specifiers, all trying to meet those needs, now there are even individual purchasers coming together to call for data from EPDs. And using Owner's Can as an example here, but there are many more of those private procurement efforts that are popping up. And because EPDs are being used to make decisions, those PCRs need to be created in that same consistent way. So talking about what and who is a program operator. ISO 14025 is the international standard for developing EPDs, which are subject to the administration of a program operator. So the role of a program operator is to run an EPD program, maintain it according to those updated standards and best practices, create PCRs, and publish EPDs. So most often a program operator will have a solid practicing knowledge of all things LCA. The standard definitely does not restrict the type of bodies who can be program operators. So that could be a company, group companies, industry association, public agency, or some other independent organization. But Sustainable Minds maintains our own set of program instructions. So those outline the standards that we conform to, data management, the methodology we use, how we facilitate review and verification, and generally just that process for creating PCRs and publishing EPDs. So we'll talk a little bit about the PCR creation process, how that works. If you're wondering whether there's already a PCR for your products, you can search the North American PCR catalog. There's a link in there. And that has all PCRs created by North American program operators who are listed in the left column here. And if you find one that applies, you can get started with an LCA service provider. But if you can't find a PCR, you're not sure if one applies to your product, you can contact a program operator. So here we've laid out the stages of PCR creation, starting with that first step to choose a program operator. They will create that PCR according to their program. So it's important to discern which programs are following best practice, keeping up to date. And of course, question you might ask about that program, is it conformant to the latest guidance, like the ACLC PCR open standards? Terry will talk about that in the next few slides. But with EPA drafting PCR criteria based on that open standard, I'm sure that that list of program operators conforming to all of those criteria will grow in the coming months and years. So after you choose a program operator, the next step is to put together a PCR committee. So that involves outreach to manufacturers, their suppliers, LCA experts, industry associations, product purchasers, and any other interested stakeholders. And that committee meets regularly to develop the PCR, which then gets reviewed by technical experts. Those people have LCA knowledge, expertise. And then that undergoes a 30-day public consultation. And then finally, the PCR is published, and if it follows the open standard, it's published with all of those comments compiled and those ACL checklists completed, along with the committee's responses to all those comments.
So now that you know there's standards driving the PCR creation process, what is the ACLCA PCR open standard in addition, and how is it used? So getting back to our saga of why there aren't enough PCRs and the history of PCR creation, back in 2013, the PCR committee at the ACLCA said, well, we should write some guidance for how PCRs get created. So there's some, at least some oversight in North America for the different program operators who are creating PCR. So PCR committee at ACLCA created the first guidance document, and we did a survey. All of the North American program operators did align their technical programs to that 2013 guidance document. And so in 2019, 2020, folks started to realize that that document needed some updating because now there really was an increasing demand for PCRs. Technical standards had changed. EPDs were being used for different reasons, and creating that guidance document was a lot of work in the first place. And it was, being a volunteer organization, it was a heavy lift to get people interested enough to get going on a new one. But something important happened, which was that folks over at the Federal Highway FHWA, they had funded a research project on the standardization of PCRs and the importance of creating reliable and consistent and standardized PCRs if government was going to do public procurement to reduce carbon emissions. How was that all going to work? And so the folks who they had contracted with to do that work, Amlan Mukherjee, Jade Bite, they came to the ACLCA and said, we did this whole bunch of research that FHWA funded and they're willing to give it to the ACLCA as a catalyst to restart this PCR guidance project. And so now I've told you about my interest in, wow, how is this ever going to work? There's never going to be enough PCRs. Thinking that since 2012, I actually volunteered to chair that working group. And so for 2 years, from 2020 to 2022, Heather Amlan and I co-chaired that working group of about 20 people, excellent LCA analysts, all names you would recognize. And we all dug in and literally met every Tuesday for 2 years to develop this open standard. And we actually were a little bit motivated by fear, because the worst case scenario would be, we knew that the federal government was going to need standards for public procurement as well as state governments, because buy clean programs were happening. And so we thought, do we really want the government to become a program operator? We thought, no, that shouldn't happen. The industry needs to step up, get itself pulled together, and rise to the challenge so that government doesn't need to step in and do it. So this was the motivator, this was the driver to create standardized, consistent, and reliable PCRs and EPDs for transparency, procurement, and supply chain data. And the reason that we were very explicit about those 3 purposes is because one of the things that we recognized was that people are using EPDs for different reasons. It used to just be for transparency. So the demand through lead was just to be transparent. There was no criteria around what the results needed to be or performance criteria. But clearly what had been evolving and emerging was using EPDs not only for purchase decisions for procurement, but the supply chain purpose of EPDs to be able to, for an end product manufacturer, to be able to get the actual qualified data around the components that they're using in their products is becoming even increasingly more critical. And so, the state of the industry is that there is not a good publicly available data set of standard data to use to go input into that process. So that's actually a big component of standardizing PCRs, and Kim's going to speak to that too, is the requirement to use consistent, publicly available underlying data sets. And ultimately also that EPDs cannot be captured in PDFs anymore. The world is digital, and getting data out of PDFs is too hard, and that we are at the point in time when everything is digital first, and then maybe print or paper. So there's a lot of transformation that has been needing to happen in the PCR industry that is now really being driven by, guess what we had imagined was going to happen with handwriting on the wall in 2020, it's happened. The federal government is now requiring PCRs for public procurement. States are, private procurement is going to be following suit. Some of it is already. And so what we developed in that working group was a framework, so the core guidance, and then separating out methodologies for calculating different things that are not covered in other ISO standards or other standards. So we created a whole list of methodologies that were going to need to be developed and documented so that the entire LCA industry would be using the same calculation methods and models for the LCA, so that each product group, again, standardization, same calculation methods, the industry deciding on how it's going to get done, and then everybody using it. But the core guidance, the PCR process, was based on the awareness that it's people that drive a process. And if people are given good instructions about their role and responsibilities with very explicit results, then this could all be packaged, standardized, and anybody with the appropriate intent and knowledge should be able to implement this program. So the three participants in creating a PCR is the program operator, the PCR committee, that's the people who are from the industry, who need the PCR to be able to measure and report on their products, and then the PCR review panel to make sure that the PCR was developed in accordance with the technical standards. So we created 3 checklists. The checklists are very detailed. I actually had a close-up of one of these in a different slide. I took it out. But what you see here is there's the program operator checklist, which is a lot longer than the PCR committee checklist, which is longer than the review panel checklist, broken down by task type. These are criteria of what needs to happen. Everything that you see in red says that it shall, everything else is should. We reference the ISO standards that support the criteria. This describes the supporting documentation that must be provided to demonstrate the criteria has been met. And then each criteria is a contributor to an EPD type. So this was in response to realizing that EPDs are getting used for different purposes. And so different levels of rigor, if you will, are going to be required to meet the threshold of reliability. And so, the base type of EPD, its purpose is for transparency. And again, that's what LEED has required. That's your kind of traditional EPD that people are creating. The next level is for public procurement. That's what the government's looking for. And then finally, the highest level is for a data source. So when an EPD is creating data that will be made available publicly to get used in both component and full-on EPDs, that has the highest level of rigor and review. And so in the checklists, if you go back, you can see that we've identified which criteria is required for each EPD use case. And so 27 of the original draft, 27 were for transparency, 20 were for public procurement, and 3 were specific to data source. So that meant to get a data source level to get a data source level EPD, every single criteria in the checklist must be met. And so as I mentioned, in the checklist, you can see which criteria are required. There's way more requirements for program operators than for PCR committee members or even reviewers. And that got published in 2022. We did a lot of webinars. We had public webinars, we did government webinars. It's available to download. The ACLCA continues the working group. It is meant to be a living standard, which is why it's called an open standard. It went through several rounds of public comment and review, which will continue to happen. Each of the methodology addenda goes through public comment and review. And as they get published, they get posted to the ACLCA website. And you'll see now that several program operators are starting or have started to make their technical programs conformant with the 2022 open standard. And now Kim's going to, so I'm going to show you how with that work that we did in advance of the impending government action, how then the EPA was able to take that work that we did with, knowing what they were going to need and build on it. So the EPA created their own draft guidance, again, looked at a lot of standardization, not just the ACLCA open standard, but looked at other standardization practices, initiatives, demands, and came up with their draft, put it out for public comment. Anyone could comment, so Sustainable Minds submitted our own comments. The ACLCA PCR committee submitted our own comments. And now the EPA is sorting through all those comments and will ultimately publish their PCR criteria, which is specifically in support of the low carbon labeling program, the low embodied carbon labeling program that they will be rolling out. So think of Energy Star. This is a new Energy Star, a whole low carbon labeling program where now products that meet the carbon thresholds that will be set will be labeled as such. And now buyers and specifiers and procurers will be able to see clearly the EPDs that have been made from PCRs that are conformant with this guidance and that will meet the thresholds of low embodied carbon that the EPA will set. So in our analysis, both at the ACLCA and at Sustainable Minds, we looked at what of the ACLCA checklist criteria did they use, and the fact that they used the checklist model and the criteria model, we just laid a lot of the groundwork for them. And so their folks then really had to think clearly about, for government public procurement, what must also be happening, again, to support this low carbon labeling program. And so a lot of the criteria, again, really looks at more strictly enforcing underlying data requirements, prescription of background data sets, everything that's going to drive greater standardization and assuredness of the quality of the results. So with that, over to Kim to talk about, once the ACLCA open standard was done, what did Sustainable Minds do with it? Go ahead, Kim.
Sure. Let's see. So I was surprised to find that most of the changes from the open standard were to the program instructions rather than to just Part A or Part B inclusions or requirements themselves. But we were pleasantly surprised to see that by putting the onus on the program operators to change their program, it facilitated the creation of better tools, lessened the burden on the PCR committee, which made it also easier for the reviewers to review. So it did take about 4 to 5 months to incorporate everything, and ran into some bumps along the way, but we've kind of used that as an opportunity to roll those comments into the next version of the open standard, which we're working on with the ACLCA working group. And there were some specific examples about what changed in our program, like in that program operator checklist, there's a criterion that adds a step of checking whether that PCR can be used for procurement purposes, and then gives the original PCR commissioner 30 days to reconvene a PCR committee. But that creates this potential for duplicate PCRs. So if that committee, for whatever reason, couldn't be reconvened within 30 days, it wouldn't necessarily meet that requirement. So the suggestion from one of our reviewers was to remove the timeline on the reconvening and instead have a timeline for some sort of response from the program operator of that original PCR. So that change then gives time for other program operators to consider support for any changes that are needed. And then that way, with our updated program, clarifies that, you know, our intent is not to create duplicate PCRs, but just to strengthen and speed up that PCR development process, we could create more EPDs. In the end, we were able to implement all of those criteria listed in the open standard. So we learned that some of those overlapping or confusing issues could be solved, and the changes to our process could be worked out. And something else that we found was the requirements for the underlying LCA that's referenced in the PCR creation weren't necessarily, clear. They were sometimes strict, and it led to this question of whether that underlying LCA should have to be done concurrently with PCR creation, or whether an already completed LCA could be referenced, also known as reference LCA, and that PCR could be improved by the, whichever pitfalls of that LCA.
Hey, Kim,
So,
can I ask you to explain what's the purpose of the underlying LCA? Because this might be a new concept for people.
absolutely. Yeah, so the underlying LCA is done for the product that the PCR product group covers, so that there could be hotspot analysis to say, all right, we have all of these rules and assumptions defined for cradle to gate, but 80% of our impacts are coming from the use stage. So that comes from that looking at reference LCAs, performing the underlying LCA, doing that hotspot analysis to kind of like redirect the PCR committee's attention to, maybe we need more defined assumptions for the use stage, so that the total amount of impacts from that one stage can be made more certain and have less variability, or at least be better defined.
I think it's a really important point, particularly for people on this call who are be working on PCRs at any point in the future. This is kind of new to North American program operators, because the point is that the people involved in the stakeholder group who are manufacturers, there may or may not have ever been an LCA done for any of their products. That's part of the role of the program operators, to go out and do research to see if there is any LCA anywhere that's ever been done. But if there's not been an LCA done, then there is no actual understanding, as Kim pointed out, of where the impacts are occurring in the life cycle of that product. And therefore, the rules for comparability or the use cases that are built into the PCR can't be developed without insights into understanding, where are those hotspots and what are the use cases then that should be developed so that each manufacturer can measure those hotspots in the same way. And so if there is an underlying LCA, an LCA that's been done somewhere by somebody else, that can often be used as the reference to analyze as input into the PCR. But if there is none, this is what Kim was saying about it can impact the Part B timeline and scope. If a manufacturer then does an LCA concurrent with the PCR project and then shares it with the working group.
Yeah, and in the past, there has been, of course, the requirement to do, with the PCR committee has that process of doing and rather informal hotspot analysis, where they're, going through that process of setting up an LCA, but not necessarily publishing it. And if they do publish it, publishing to older PCR or older LCAs or LCAs that don't follow the latest and greatest. So, the new requirement introduced in the EPA draft criteria and from ACLCA for that underlying LCA to be performed concurrently, gets into project scoping. If you're trying to find sponsors for that. But ultimately, what we've learned from implementing the open standard is that it does enable just that creation of the higher quality PCR, adds clarity to the review process, important step for public procurement. And while it does require a lot of change to our program instructions and added in sometime in the program operator's end, that time up front by the program operator means that the PCR committee can just focus more on the rules that apply only to their product category. So that results in a PCR committee process that is faster for participants and streamlines that PCR creation process overall.
So one last insider point on this topic, because it is so important. This underlying LCA requirement has not been embraced by all North American program operators who would like to have their program be conformant, for the very reason that it can slow down a project. It does create complications, just like Kim has said. And so there's debate internally about whether that requirement should be kept in the ACLCA open standard. But it's important to note that the EPA has come down even harder on that requirement. So it is unlikely to go away. It's unlikely to be taken out of the ACLCA program. So any program operator who says their program is conformant and does not meet that criteria, then that PCR technically is not conformant to the ACLCA PCR open standard. Back to you, Kim.
Alrighty. All right, so as a result of updating our program, we became the first program operator to update our Part A to allow for the creation of those open standard conformant PCRs. And we recently published the PCR for utility pools and updated 6 plumbing Part Bs, which are all conformant to that open standard. So if we take a look at this column of the North American PCR catalog, you can see which PCRs have already been published to be conformant to the open standard. And then once that EPA PCR draft criteria are finalized and those get incorporated into program operators program instructions and all that, we do anticipate a new column to be showing conformance to those as well.
And we also will say that, over time, we'll see how the ACLCA technical program and the EPA program either merge or align, or one becomes an appendix of the other. And so that all needs to get worked out, in the coming months. But as Kim will show you, as PCR committees develop their Part Bs, it's up to the PCR committee to identify the EPD use case, so the level of EPD, and whether they want to create a PCR that's going to be conformant to the EPA requirements. So now you understand kind of the flexibility of the criteria that get used from these different standards to create the end result that's purpose-driven. So at the beginning of the project, the PCR committee has to decide, is this EPD going to be used for data creation, public-private procurement, or for transparency? And that's going to identify the scope of criteria that need to be met to create that Part B.
So backing up a bit here, so to give you a better idea of what we're walking through, when we walk through that Part B, what does that look like? So we'll go through the components of a PCR. So PCR again stands for product category rules, and as the name implies, they define the rules for a certain category of products while performing a life cycle assessment, or LCA, which assesses environmental impacts associated with all the stages of the life cycle of a product. So some PCR programs, including the one run by us, are separated into 2 parts, where the Part A just contains that general LCA requirements applying to all products, and then Part B contains the rules specific to a product category, which consists of products that compete for or deliver the same function. So when Sustainable Minds goes to create a new PCR, only the content in Part B is developed. So that way the people who volunteer to participate on the PCR committee don't have to know everything about LCA. So by focusing on the rules that are specific to how a manufacturer's product is made, distributed, measured, how it gets installed, used, and disposed of, that is the most valuable information for the committee to be working on for the Part Bs. So starting with scope, this sets, of course, the cradle to gate or cradle to grave, which LCA stages are going to be included. And by highlighting that cradle to grave scope, we highlight the advantage of longer lasting products, lower maintenance products, and easily recyclable or reusable products, where those stages would not be considered in a cradle to gate LCA. Then a well-defined functional unit is based on the functional performance of an actual product group, so not just mass or material. So the functional unit will allow, looking at the different product attributes and material types, knowing that they were calculated using the same rules and account for that same functional performance. Similarly, defining assumptions for the life cycle stage scenarios allows us to use those same rules and account for that functional performance. So then once the Part B is finalized and published and we're ready to create an EPD, the contents of that EPD are already defined for us, as we see in our Part A Appendix C. So those EPDs can be thought of as the summary report, turning that LCA into a final public-facing summary, ideally organized and presented to make it easy for people making purchasing decisions, so they can read about the product's functional, environmental performance. And like Terry said, our transparency reports are totally digital EPDs, have been for 10 years, and they're organized to do just that. So we touched on the PCR creation process and on implementing the open standard, but how does that PCR committee process actually work? So focusing on that Part B, again, allows for that streamlined PCR creation process, usually taking about 3 to 6 months. And like we touched on earlier, PCR creation follows a standard process where Sustainable Minds and the PCR sponsor reach out to our networks, including various stakeholders, setting weekly meetings, where we walk through each section of that PCR until it's complete, get technical review, public review, and then comments, response, and finally just make those finishing touches and go live. The form for creating a Part B is only 3 pages long. So if you'd like, you can go to our program page and download one now, just to see, types of information covered and what gets walked through during those committee meetings. Here's an example showing the finalized utility poles PCR. So showing how the sections of that form are filled out. It's conformant to the open standard at that transparency level, and shows the committee members who were involved in the drafting process. So we'll talk about using ISO 21930 or using a product group specific PCR for creating EPDs. Using that idea of a 2-part PCR, so there is the option to use the most basic set of rules for building and construction products and services, which is ISO 21930. And that is the core PCR that other programs typically build onto for creating product group specific PCRs. But it is possible to just use ISO 21930 on its own to create EPDs. And there are a few reasons that a manufacturer would want to create a product group specific PCR, like if their products have a competitive advantage, in the use phase or at their end of life. So that comes into play when we're talking about products that last longer, use less energy, or more recyclable. And those product group specific PCRs are also ideal for manufacturers who are competing in the procurement space, where EPA is specifically looking for robust EPDs, which they define as including those additional gate to grave impacts. So the use of the ISO 21930 as the core PCR tends to be better for products that would look at the cradle to gate impacts anyway. And that generally wouldn't require a bunch of additional assumptions, meaning they're products with a relatively straightforward production process and complicated bill of materials. So using that as core PCR could also be a good way for smaller manufacturers to get their feet wet. These products don't necessarily have their own product group specific PCR, but they still want to enter that environmental performance space. So what using ISO 21930 as the core PCR comes down to is that it does set that minimum required base set of rules. So it can be used to create short and sweet LCAs. Again, it could be good for smaller manufacturers just wanting to get started, simple, cost effective. But since it is just the minimum, EPDs for that same type of product from different manufacturers could be totally different. I talked about use phase, this is by an order of magnitude different. So ISO 21930 doesn't consider the product function, so it has to set just a general declared unit instead of that well thought out functional unit. And then again, only that production stage is mandatory, so you might miss out on all of those impacts from the use stage and disposal stages. Then using ISO 21930 as the core PCR also prevents you from using those latest guidance and standards. So for example, you would not be able to create EPDs according to the ACLC PCR open standard, nor to the EPA PCR criteria once they're published.
That's a great explanation, Kim. I appreciate that. And I think the point to say, in our two-part program, our part A is in conformance with 21930, and we did that in 2017. In fact, Kim did that then. So doing an EPD to 21930 as the core PCR is essentially like doing an EPD. Not essentially, it is doing an EPD with no part B. You're only doing it according to the general LCA calculation rules with no specifics about the product or the product group your products are in. Okay, so how do PCR projects get funded? And that's what everybody wants to know. It is a process of figuring out, who's going to pay. Very frequently, a trade association or a group of trade associations will fund the development of a PCR where there's a common interest in that product. PCRs should be material independent. I'll repeat that. They should be material independent for products that get made from different materials. So that's why you see a flooring PCR is for all flooring, covering all material types, because that's the competitive advantage for the manufacturer that makes flooring out of wood or flooring out of resilient materials or linoleum. They're all getting measured the same way and reported the same way, and then you get to see the variability. The utility pole PCR that Kim completed at the end of the year, on the PCR committee were members from the trade associations, from the composite materials industry, the steel industry, the wood industry, and the concrete industry, because utility poles get made from all of those materials. So trade associations can write a check, one can fund it, or they can get others to fund it depending on how the scope. A group of manufacturers can get together and fund it. No trade association needs to be a part. Or a single manufacturer can sponsor it and simply say, we need this to happen. I don't want to screw around getting other people to agree to pitch in. We need this, let's do it, we're going to lead. And there are some advantages to being the sponsor, which is then you get to work with the program operator to draft the first draft that then is the baseline from which the committee starts working. So hopefully you will now be demystified about the PCR process to bring it back to where we started because of the increased demand for EPDs, and particularly with cradle to grave scope. More PCRs need to be created with cradle to gate scope to keep pace with the industry. And because EPDs are being used to make big decisions, PCRs should all be created the same way. So if you like this webinar, the next two that are coming, we'll talk about LCAs and EPDs. So now that you understand PCRs, how do they drive the LCA and EPD creation? And then the third is going to be, now that all these EPDs are getting created and have been created, how are those getting put into other tools now that people are using to calculate whole buildings, calculate emissions and impacts? And what is the state of our partner EC3? What's the challenge that they have faced digitizing EPDs, getting program operators to submit them, and where the EPDs from EC3 are flowing out to. So I appreciate everyone's time and attention today. Thank you for staying until the end. Please take a minute to respond to the questions on the way out, leave your comments, and thank you, Kim, for all the great work you do. I'm always impressed, and I hope everyone who attended learned something today, and hopefully what you were looking to learn. And we look forward to having you at our subsequent webinars. Have a great day.